Welcome back all. This session will be how we modernized our front-end tooling using Vite and Storybook. Please join me welcoming Jack to present this session. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming to my talk, everyone. If you don't know me, I'm Jack Taranto. I'm one of the front-end developers at Previous Next. I've been with Previous Next for quite a few years, and I've been doing Drupal development for almost 20 years at this point in time. So I'll start by defining what front-end tooling is. So it includes things like PostCSS, Rollup, Webpack, Babel, and Vite that transpile JavaScript and CSS to a format that web browsers can understand. It also includes linting tools like Eslint and Prettier. I'd extend the definition to include testing tools like Jest and Vitest. And today I'm going to take you through our latest iteration of this tooling and exactly how we've configured each tool. So expect a ton of config file and code examples, and at the end I'll share a link to a GitHub repository, so you've all got access to the code. So the purpose of this modernization process and our build tooling as a whole has always been about using the latest front-end technology without being tied to how Drupal is currently doing front-end. So what was our wish list? PostCSS is one of our favorite tools of all time, so we didn't want to lose that by moving to Vite. Luckily, PostCSS is included now in basically everything, so Vite has built-in support for it. For a while now, all our JavaScript has been built into native ES modules and transpiled using feature sets from browsers lists, so we didn't want to lose that either. We use React for a lot of work we do, but we wanted our build tools to support any framework and multiple frameworks at the same time. And we wanted automated testing to be a central pillar without having to write the same boilerplate tests over and over. So the finished product, Vite, is the central build tool. Components were moved out of the Drupal theme and into the root directory of our repositories. We halved the number of NPM dependencies. And because we cut down on the number of tools, now we have to maintain fewer config files. And moving to Vite and Vitest sped up CI runs and local builds. We simplified and standardized our code quality tools, and Storybook smoke tests allowed us to remove boilerplate tests. So this is what we settled on for our component directory structure. Components now live in the root of the repository, and Storybook takes its document structure from everything inside the source directory. So we use sentence case to name those subdirectories. Each component then includes its own CSS, JavaScript, Twig, Storybook definition, and tests. And then the two files down the bottom, that's where we import the component CSS and JavaScript, and they're the files that Vite builds. So all that looks a little bit like single directory components. I'll stop now to say that it's not SDC. At this stage, we made a decision not to use SDC in our projects at Previous Next. After evaluating it internally, it felt a lot like another Drupalism. So with SDC, your components end up tied to Drupal via SDC's unique YAML format. It's all very Drupal-centric. So we don't think that components need to be tied back to Drupal. Ideally, they're completely agnostic. Additionally, SDC's Storybook integration also leaves you with something that's really non-standard. Writing stories for Storybook in YAML felt like we were going against the grain. So instead of using SDC, our approach is to use Storybook natively to define components. So this is our previous build stack. These are all separate build processes, typically run via NPM scripts. Rollup was pretty standard on all our projects. It's been around for a while, works with basically everything. It's infinitely customizable, but it's also really complicated to set up. It uses Babel and Core.js to transpile JavaScript for the browser. They're also pretty complicated to set up. PostCSS and various plugins built our CSS, and instead of using Storybook, we've been using KSS for many years. It was wrapped in a gulp script as well. Our testing stack used Nightwatch for functional and accessibility testing, and Jest for unit testing. So this is the new stack. These three tools do basically everything the previous stack did. Vite handles asset building, Storybook documents and test components, and Vitest is our test runner. So what is Vite exactly? Vite's a modern build tool that's really easy to use. I think what happened with all these tools, they've been around for so long, the web has changed so much. In that time, they all ended up catering for so many different options and just became really complicated. So it's kind of like a reset button. It removes all that complexity and just gives us straightforward, well-documented options. It's a new tool, but it's version 6 now, so it's also very mature. So a huge part of simplifying our build tools was the reduction of config files. This is what we're looking at now. We used to have way more than this. So Vite is typically used to build things like single-page apps. For Drupal and really any component library, we won't be using Vite's default build options. Instead, we use something called library mode. Library mode in Vite is a selection of options that it takes entry points and then runs them through its build pipeline and spits them out into directory. Essentially, it's building our assets without having any bigger picture of how they'll be used. So this is Vite's config file, and this is what we came up with to use library mode with a dynamic component library. We use a file glob and a naming convention to tell Vite which files we want it to build. Each JS build file has an entry.js file extension. We also ignore the parts of our code base we don't want Vite to look in for these files. And the glob gets passed through to Vite's library mode, and then we output to Drupal's libraries directory. So that covers JS only. Previously, PostCSS was run in a separate build step, but we're also using Vite to build CSS as well now. So yeah, Vite has built-in support for PostCSS. So all we need to do is add a CSS glob, and it will pick up CSS files and build them for us, just like the JS entry points. We also add an ignore for CSS partials. They start with an underscore, so the individual component CSS doesn't always get built out into its own file. And to disable Vite's default CSS behavior, you need to add CSS code split to true. And yeah, you can also add any PostCSS plugins directly to Vite's config here as well. So you don't need to maintain a separate PostCSS config file. So yeah, Vite's big draw, one of Vite's big draw cards is its plugin architecture. It has plugins for all frameworks. And to make things better for our use case, although I didn't mention this before, under the hood, Vite's build mode is just running rollup. So rollup plugins are all compatible with Vite out of the box. So if you're using rollup at the moment, it's relatively easy to move to Vite. So here I'm adding 3 plugins: the Drupal Twig plugin, so we can import and render Twig; the React plugin, so we can write some of our components in React; and also the Vue plugin, so we can write components in Vue too if we want to. And file extensions are important, so out of the box, Vite will use the appropriate plugin for Twig, JSX, and Vue file extensions. So the last piece of our Vite config involves using browsers list. Vite uses ESBuild and its built-in feature sets to transpile JavaScript. So that felt like a little bit of a downgrade from our previous tooling, which was using Babel and its env or env presets. So env presets come from feature sets defined by browsers list. So after looking around for a bit, we found a solution to use browsers list directly with Vite. So yeah, this is the browsers list website. It's a great resource to see which browsers your finished code will be compatible with. We just went with a greater than 1% in Australia. And yeah, these browsers are pretty decent or pretty recent, which means we can use most modern web features. And we added a browsers list RC file to store the config in a way that was easy to spot. So to use browsers list with Vite, we need another dependency, browsers list to ESBuild. This just converts the feature sets from browsers list into a format that ESBuild and Vite can understand, and it's easy enough to configure. So yeah, this is the final config file for Vite, and as part of this, we've been able to now remove config files for Babel, Rollup, and PostCSS and replace it with this one file. So we opted to standardize on Storybook to document our component libraries. It's version 8 now and extremely mature. So if you're not using it already, now's the time to start. It's never too late. It provides a fantastic developer experience with hot module reloading, and it makes design QA a really painless process, as every designer is familiar with it. So let's take a look at how we're using it with Vite. So this is our main Storybook config file. It's really tiny, which is ideal because configuring Storybook can be quite difficult. And the magic here is in using the Vite-based framework. So all of our Storybook build rules will now come directly from our Vite config. So the Vite config file has become the single source of truth as to how the whole project is built. Using Storybook and Drupal together has always been a bit of a leap. The two tools haven't always been the greatest of friends. So the Vite Twig Drupal plugin by Lee Rowlands has solved that problem. It lets us render component markup using Twig in Storybook. And I definitely recommend checking out Lee's lightning talk from DrupalSouth last year. So this is our card components markup written in Twig, and this is the Storybook definition file, which imports the Twig and then passes it through to the story. So yeah, we don't need to specify a component name or title, as that all comes from the components directory structure I showed before. We can specify default arguments which get rendered to the Twig template. Again, it's really minimal config for what used to be quite complex. And this looks exactly like a React story too, which is a great place to be considering Twig and Storybook have never played great together. And yeah, behind the scenes, Lee's Vite plugin is reading the Twig file, and it's using Twig.js to convert it to a JS function, and then Storybook can then use it as a regular component with its full feature set. So composition is the Storybook feature that allows you to have components from multiple frameworks documented in one place. It works really well with Vite as well. So to use composition, you actually need to have two instances of Storybook running side by side. I've added a new config file for a React Storybook using the Vite framework. The HTML Storybook is our primary Storybook instance, so it has the refs key added to its config, which points to where the React Storybook is running. And the good thing about this is both Storybooks are still using the exact same Vite config file, which is our single source of truth. So now when we load up the HTML Storybook, the React components will show up in the same document. Okay, so we're building our components with Vite and we're adding them to Storybook. How do we actually use all this with the Drupal website? So the files that Vite outputs with library mode are easy. We just need to add Drupal library definitions for them. We typically have a library definition for each JS entry point and CSS file. And because Vite's handling the minification, we just set minified as true. And seeing as we're using native VS modules, we set type as module. And fetch priority low will often get you better Core Web Vitals scores. So we wrap JS calls in Drupal in calls to Drupal behaviors, and we use Drupal's jQuery free once function. And we tried to make things as concise here as possible to cut down on boilerplate. So this will call component JavaScript for all instances of a component on a page. And we take a similar approach to render a React app in Drupal. In this example, we're using a JSON encoded data attribute to pass props from Drupal through to the React app. So since we're not using SDC, how are we rendering components in Drupal? So if you caught Adam Bramley's talk before, you'll be familiar with Pinto, and you probably heard Lee Rowland's name dropping it in his talk. If not, it's a new module. It's written by Dan Finn at Previous Next. To compare it to SDC, instead of using YAML to define components, it's using PHP objects. So it meshes really well with bundle classes. You can type check component arguments. You can use traits to reduce duplicate code. And it has baked in support for cacheable metadata as well. And it will use the same Twig files in our components directory to render. So if you did miss Adam's talk, he's written a few blog posts on the PNX website. I'll link to them at the end. Okay, so now we're building and theming what improvements have been made to testing. So break testing up into three distinct steps. Code quality or linting, Storybook smoke tests, and functional unit testing with Vitest. So this is our lineup for code quality tools. I'm sure everyone's probably using these already. I'll just touch on them briefly. I think these three tools are all that you need. Prettier formats and checks files so our code is all formatted the same. It does it automatically, and you should set your IDE to do it on save so you don't have to think about it. Eslint is incredibly powerful. It's also incredibly difficult to configure. So we tried out its new configuration style, and it's slightly easier. Stylelint's very similar to Eslint, but for CSS. So this is the new Eslint config style. We import just the standard Eslint JS configs, and we use the prettier preset to so our linting rules match what prettier is outputting. We pass through Drupal globals so they don't throw errors. File ignores get specified in this file too. Our Stylelint config just uses the standard config set. We have some custom rules, but the aim is just to keep this file as small as possible. And so we're using Storybook smoke tests to run automated snapshot and accessibility tests on each component. So snapshot tests are they're great for a component test because they will immediately tell you if markup has changed by accident without having some of the headaches associated with visual regression testing. Automated accessibility tests are also a great tool to see if a component code fails a WCAG standard, although I'll make clear that it's not a replacement for accessibility user testing. This is our Storybook test runner config. Previously, we were using Nightwatch to run Axe for automated accessibility testing and Jest to run snapshot testing. However, this required having a separate test file for Nightwatch and Jest, and for each component, it meant a huge number of virtually identical boilerplate tests. So this code allowed us to remove all that, and these smoke tests get run on each story. So smoke tests also run anything that is inside the play function on the component. So here's just a really cut down example of a Storybook play function. The Storybook test package includes a bunch of wrappers around standard testing tools like expect and testing libraries user event. So you can write full-blown functional tests here and include them as part of each story. So using the play function is great, and it's a nice way to tie testing into your component's definition. However, with more complex components and even whole applications, the better tool to use is definitely Vitest. So Vitest is to jest what Vite is to rollup. It takes a venerable tool that's complex to configure and simplifies it without reinventing the wheel. And at its heart is Vite. So like Storybook, Vitest inherits its configuration from Vite. So all we need to do to set it up is to add some test options and we're up and running. So testing library is the tool that turns Vitest tests into functional tests. It's the same tool that Storybook uses in its smoke tests and its test package. So we've got two separate test runners that are both using the same testing framework. So here's an example Vitest test. For anyone familiar with Jest, it looks identical. Here we're pulling in the HTML from our components Twig file and passing in the arguments from Storybook to render the component and run our expect function. And yeah, the aim here is to reuse our component's definition to run the test against. So yeah, here's the full lineup of tools that we've ended up on. So we build assets with Vite and PostCSS. Storybook documents our components and runs smoke tests. Prettier Eslint and Stylelint keep our code clean. And Vitest and testing library run our functional tests. So yeah, as I mentioned, I set up a code repository with all of the code examples you've seen here. You can download that and you can run the build tools on your local machine to play around with them. And yeah, this talk was more or less spun out of a blog post I did last year, so that's another good place to dig into. And yeah, take a look at the two blog posts from Adam Bramley if you're interested in using Pinto. So yeah, that's it. I'll stop for some questions. Thanks, everyone.
Have you tried the Storybook module where you can write your story?
Have we tried the Storybook module? No, I don't think so.
Basically, you can write your stories in Twig and then it converts it into JSON.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, the aim of the game was to really just make Storybook as vanilla as possible. So we didn't want to do anything outside of the box with Storybook. Like ideally, we're writing the stories the same way that they're documented on the Storybook website. So it's just easy for, it's easy for new devs to come on. It's easy to hand projects over. And that the Drupal Twig plugin that Lee wrote does that really well. It's just sort of literally just taking the HTML and, letting Storybook access it, really. Yeah.
So you get the React components, so both Twig complex components. Where do you use those React components?
In a Drupal site. So yeah, in that Drupal behaviors example I had. The question was how we use React components where we use React components. Yeah. So yeah, if there's any kind of basic level of interactivity, I probably prefer to write components in React at this point in time and probably have like a static HTML only version of them. But if it's like an accordion or, something that you want to React, I would make a JSX version of it as well. And then, yeah, using that Drupal behaviors snippet I showed before, just treating you can use the data attribute to pass props through and then just render the React component in Drupal. It's a bit like the Astro framework. It's got this concept of islands. So the whole page is static, but like parts of the page are powered by React. So it's the same concept, but Drupal's still building the page, and then React is taking over different components there. So having the two storybooks running side by side allows us to do that. We can have the majority of static content components written in Twig, which works really well with Drupal and Pinto, and then when we need like some more special source, we can have React versions running there as well. Yeah, in the same project. Yeah, okay.
What if you want to use those React components in, say, a Next.js?
Yeah, so if we wanted to use React components in another application, yeah, that's also the concept of keeping things agnostic from Drupal. So making sure that the component library is really quite separate from Drupal and it's not doing anything too specific to Drupal. So yeah, we've got the Twig components there, but in Storybook, Twig's actually quite a nice way to get static HTML markup into Storybook. So I think that's legit. But yeah, the React components, you can use Storybook composition to maintain two separate component libraries that live side by side. But yeah, then you're writing React versions of all your Twig components, which is perfectly fine. You can do that as well. The CSS is then the kind of common thread between the two components. It's just like how the markup's being output. So yeah, if you're writing a whole library of React components, then you can use them in any application because they're not tied back to Drupal. Anything else? Cool. Thanks, everyone.